Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today and joining us as we talk about some instructional principles for your online training. My name is Bo Dezonnier. I am the Client Development Manager here at Onlea, and we're going to get started as it is 1 o'clock. Before we do, I'm just going to go through a couple of housekeeping rules that we have right now. So as you can see, you're muted right now. With your videos, you're welcome to turn them on or off. It's really up to you. We're going to be recording this webinar, and we also have some Onlea staff on hand to answer any of the questions at the end of the presentation. But they'll also be monitoring the chat window. So if as we're going through, you have questions that are popping up, please ask them in the chat window. Feel free to ask them there. Jeff Woodward, our creative director, will do his best to answer it. If he can't, we'll wait until at the end for the Q&A session to answer those and clarify them. And I also have a live transcript on right now. So if you require captions, there should be a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can turn that on, and you'll see the captions as they pop up. Jeff should also be posting in a link in the chat of how to manage and view the closed captions. So, and with that, I'll just jump into a quick introduction of who Onlea is, in case no one is aware of that. But just a little background on us. So we were founded in 2014 by a group of visionaries that understood that online education was an incredible opportunity to rethink how we teach and learn, to build systems that are more human, more flexible, more accessible, that lift people and communities up in ways we hadn't previously imagined. And those are the fundamental principles that drive Onlea to this day, which is reflected in our identity. Onlea invents and produces mindful online learning crafted with scholarship, creativity, and quality. We are rooted in education, and now we are bringing these principles and best practices into different settings in need of a guiding hand in the online training space. Whether you need help building a course or a program, or simply need some help on lifting your online webinars or classes, we can help. And since our inception, we have built amazing award-winning courses pushing the boundaries of digital learning. Our productions have engaged over 1 million learners in 167 countries around the world. And while we have clients around the world, our team is pretty local. We're based in Alberta, Canada, with most of us living in the Edmonton area. And we are a team of creative minds engaged in building a future where people are more connected, empowered, and supported. And we basically believe if you can teach it online, and we figured out ways to teach really diverse material and do it well. And so today we're going to talk about some of the instructional principles that we use to make sure learners are engaged and get the most out of the training. So at this time, I would like to hand it off to two of our instructional designers at Onlea, who will be your presenters for today. And they are Sherry Fricker and Jennifer Delisle.
Great, thanks, Bo. So I'm Sherry. I will get us started today with putting the learner first. So at Onlea, we like to say we put the learner first. What does that really mean? It really comes down to three foundations: an understanding of how the learning brain works, discovering and tapping into the learner's motivation rather than trying to create motivation from outside, and considering the learner as a human being within a social and cultural context. Let's begin with the learning brain. Here is a basic model of how our brains work. We take in information with our various senses, and a lot of it we don't even pay attention to. It's immediately forgotten. But some of that information makes its way into our working memory. That's where our brains do the work of processing that information. We make meaning of it, sort it, decide what's important, and some more of it is forgotten. If we're lucky, some of it is encoded into long-term memory. If it makes it in there, theoretically, we can also retrieve it when we need it. Cognitive load theory was first named by John Sweller. It states that working memory can generally hold a limited amount of information at any one time. Cognitive overload happens when that capacity is exceeded. When that happens, very little of the information gets encoded into long-term memory. And there are a lot of ways that can happen in a course.
So one of those ways that can happen is with the wrong content. So because our brains have limited capacity, we have to make sure that we're only filling them with what's really important. And so we determine this by first identifying, what do the learners really need to know? So don't think of it in terms of what is typically covered in that course. Instead, think about it in terms of learner competencies. So what do they need to be able to do at the end of the course? What problems does this course need to solve? What concrete skills do the learners need to have? For example, a lot of people are required by law to take a Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or WHMIS, course to do their job. Many of you have probably had to do that. So they don't really need to know the design principles behind the creation of the WHMIS pictograms. They need to know that this symbol means corrosive. I think you can see how important that could be in certain situations on the job. If your course is more abstract or theoretical, you can still think in these terms. So teaching 20th century Canadian literature is very different from teaching WHMIS, but you can still think of it in terms of important takeaways. So maybe it's important for them to recognize the influence of 1970s regionalism on Canadian poetry. Or maybe it's something more skills-based, like analyze a novel. The point is, you can't cover everything in the field, so start by determining what will serve your learners best. From there, you want to create clear, measurable learning outcomes to frame your course. So a lot of instructors create learning outcomes because there's a place for them on the syllabus, but never actually think about them after. Once you have them, you actually want to use them as a tool to help guide the creation of your content, as well as any assignment, quiz, or exam. The questions that you ask should test those outcomes and not anything else. Sherry likes to say that the learning outcomes are like a colander or a sieve. When you pour your content through it, the learning outcomes catch what's really important, and everything else should just filter through. So we have a question for you. Imagine you have some facts that are really interesting, but not really part of the learning outcomes. So say you're teaching somebody digital photography. You really want to include the fascinating history of the camera, thinking that these fun facts will increase engagement. So you decide to separate it from the main content and include it in a differently colored call-out box called Did You Know? Do you think this is a good strategy? And Bo's going to put up a poll so you can all take your guess. Is this a good strategy? You can drag the poll to the side if you want to reread the question. We'll give you a few moments to think about it and give your answer. All right, so we have some results here. Hopefully you can all see those results. We've got 48% said yes, this is a good strategy. 29% said no. 24% said not sure. So really a mixed bag there. That's really interesting. The problem, well, the answer is maybe not the best strategy. And it's really easy to see why you would think that it might be. But here's the reason why it's not the best. The problem with that kind of bonus content is that it's often more memorable than the main content. No matter how you separate it out, even if you're putting it in that separate box with a different color, it still might take up that space in the working memory that should be reserved for what's really important. Oops.
All right. So even if we're only delivering the content that's critical, it's still possible for us to demand too much of one's working memory at any given time. The solution to this can actually be fairly simple. It doesn't take much to give our brains a little break, transfer what we've learned into our long-term memory, and open up our working memory's capacity again. Simply segmenting or chunking content into smaller, more manageable pieces is key to comprehension and retention. It's also psychologically daunting to be confronted with a wall of text. If you are creating asynchronous learning, aim to keep your topic areas under 20 minutes. Less is better. And within those topics, think of chunks of text no longer than 200 words, because remember, less is better. And videos, please limit those to no more than 5 minutes. Content can be broken up by headers, visuals, and layout. It can also be really helpful to pause for a knowledge check or a reflection question that prompts learners to stop and think about what they've learned. This is key to active learning. Research suggests that having to scroll through content increases that cognitive load. So have learners scroll to the next subtopic or section, but avoid scrolling within it. If you are delivering content in a synchronous format, you probably have less control over how long a class will be, but you still want to think in terms of short chunks. Break it up by pausing for questions, or by asking questions, or inserting some kind of multimedia. You can use your slide deck to help give that indication that you're moving on to a new topic. Cognitive overload also happens when learners have to figure out something that's outside of the content we want them to focus on, such as how to navigate a course, or what they have to do in an interaction, or what those big words mean in that sentence. This means that navigation must be intuitive, simple, and consistent. Make sure it's clear how to get to the next slide or piece of content, back out, pause, and so on. It also means using plain language. Even if your learners are highly educated, if you are using really sophisticated words and long, complex sentences, some of that brain power is going to be diverted to parsing the sentences out rather than absorbing the content. And there are lots of great resources out there on plain language. For interactions or quiz questions, make sure the instructions are simple and clear. Even in a basic multiple choice question, if your question or STEM includes lots of extra details, or if you're asking learners to choose from negative answers or complex answers like A and D, you are asking them to divert some of their cognitive energy from answering the question correctly to figuring out what the question is asking. So here's an example of a terrible question. So which is not a primary color? And the answer choices are A, red, B, orange, C, purple, or D, B, and C. So we're not doing this as a poll. We're telling you outright that it is a terrible question. So let's start with the first reason that this is not a good question. So we have the word not in the question stem. Research shows that negatively worded questions are harder to understand and easier to mess up when answering. Another reason this is not a great question is when writing questions, you should make sure that there's only one correct answer. This question technically has 3 correct answers and can be problematic to students who are prone to overthinking, as well as when tests are timed. So a student might read until they find the first correct answer and then just move on.
So our brains take in information through different channels. What we are able to hear, we process through our auditory channel, and what we are able to see, we process through our visual channel. And the visual channel includes both images and text that we read. So this is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Our brains, if we can both see and hear, can process information coming into both channels at once if they're complementary. And that means that we are getting double the value from that learning. But if what's coming into those channels is conflicting or competing, what we understand and retain from either one is reduced. So here's an example. We're watching a video about how to change a light bulb with an animation and a voiceover. The audio is explaining in words, what the animation is showing us with visuals on screen. Our ability to understand that process is vastly improved. Compare that to a scenario where there's text on screen that's different from the words in the voiceover. Maybe it's a quote from Thomas Edison. Maybe it's the steps to changing the light bulb just worded a bit differently and not timed with a voiceover. Or maybe the words are exactly the same, but there's a lot of them and we're reading them at a different speed from the voiceover or the instructor. So our brains have trouble processing both at once. We don't learn as much from either. So we have another question for you. You are building a course on how to change a light bulb. The voiceover is going through the steps, and on screen you have this GIF. And for those of you following along today with only audio, it's a GIF from the show Schitt's Creek. Moira finds a light bulb in a drawer and then looks like she has an idea. So it's kind of funny, it captures our attention. So is this a good strategy? More answers coming in. There we go. All right, here's our results. 75% of you said no, 14% said yes, 11% not sure. So let's unpack it. Since the visual is really compelling or dynamic, but doesn't actually teach us anything, so it doesn't show the steps that are described in the voiceover, when we get to the test, we would remember that GIF probably better than the content that we need to know. So while it might be kind of fun, might increase some engagement in terms of improving learning, it's unfortunately probably not a best strategy. If it were a funny GIF showing the thing that we actually need to teach, then it would be great. In this case, it's probably distracting.
Now that we know a little bit more about our brains, let's take a look at what motivates us. Our approach to motivating learners is guided by the principles of self-determination theory. This theory says that people are motivated by three basic needs: competency, autonomy, and relatedness. Competency is the belief that you have the ability to accomplish a task. If your student doesn't think that they have the ability to learn the material or do the skill, they might not even try to learn it. Autonomy is having some control over your own learning. Your students are more motivated if they feel like they're able to make some decisions about the learning with guidance, practice and explore a bit on their own, and take an active role in their learning instead of passively receiving information from a sage on a stage. Relatedness is a sense of social connection. Students are more motivated if they feel connected to their instructor and their peers. So how do we foster these things? We can increase competence by giving them lots of chances to practice in low stakes environments and by giving them positive, constructive, and prompt feedback. This might mean some ungraded multiple choice questions at the end of a section, or a checklist that allows them to track their progress. Foster autonomy by letting them work through asynchronous material at their own pace and by helping them make connections between the learning and their own goals. Create a sense of relatedness with discussion boards, icebreakers, or group activities. Even if your course is completely asynchronous, you can foster a sense of relatedness by using instructor videos or writing in some real life anecdotes so students feel like they're learning from a real person. Connect the content that you're teaching to real life so they can see how they might apply what they're learning in the workplace or in their relationships with others. That brings us to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. When you satisfy these three basic needs in your students, you help to foster intrinsic motivation. And this is doing something because the activity itself is inherently interesting or satisfying or enjoyable. When students are intrinsically motivated to learn, the learning tends to be much higher quality. They learn more, they learn it better, and they remember it longer. You want to be careful about trying to motivate your students with extrinsic rewards, things like badges or leaderboard scores or even grades. Many studies have found that students who are motivated by extrinsic rewards don't perform as well. External rewards might even reduce intrinsic motivation because it undermines students' feelings of competency and their ability to take responsibility for their own learning. So skip the fancy badges. Instead, tell them why they should learn what you're teaching. How will they apply it in real life? How will it help them to be safe or successful or help their community? Use assessments to make them feel supported and competent, not to catch the ones who haven't understood or not done the work. Make them want to learn because they can see the value in the learning itself.
So figuring out what motivates a learner also means thinking about the learner as a whole human being. So who are they? What are their challenges? What is their learning environment? We often start by conducting a learner empathy workshop with our clients and by creating learner personas. So here you can see the framework that we use for our empathy workshops. So first we ask, what are the learner's goals? These are often different from the instructor or organization's goals. So that's really important to remember. Maybe their goal is extrinsic, passing the course or making more money. What might be their intrinsic goals? Maybe it's something like be safe on the job site or stop climate change. What are their challenges, either with learning itself or with the content? These might be challenges with technology, learning disabilities, lack of time, etc. What are their learning scenarios? Are they using a phone or a desktop? Are they learning late at night or while trying to homeschool their kids? Are they on the bus? Are they forced to take this course or did they choose it? What's their experience with online learning? And then finally, what are the learners thinking and feeling, either before the course or after it? Do they feel empowered? Overwhelmed? Are they resistant to learning? Does the course improve their confidence? So once we've covered a board like this with lots of sticky notes and it gets quite messy and wonderful, we've really spent some time trying to empathize with the learner and see things from their perspective. And that means we have a much better idea of how to meet their needs.
We then often create learner personas. These are fictional representations of primary and secondary learners. Here's an example of a template we use to generate learner personas. Putting a name and a face to the learner, even if it's fictional, also helps you to empathize with them. We start to better understand what blocks them and what motivates them, so we can address any barriers and better tailor the learning experience to their needs. And what's interesting is I actually can tell you exactly which course Minnie was our learner persona for, so it really helps with that connection. Even if you're on your own and you don't have the benefit of a facilitated learner persona workshop, you can do these exercises. Spend some time brainstorming what you know about your learners. This will help you tap in to what motivates them. Keeping that learner persona in mind helps you to address your learners like they are real people. It's easy for instructors or subject matter experts, especially in an asynchronous course, to become focused on the content rather than the people online who will be receiving that content. Learners feel this. And the more they feel disconnected from an instructor, the less they learn. So here are some stills from 2 of the massive open online courses we've built. The courses are video-based and entirely asynchronous, but just having that real instructor present the content helps the learner to engage. Research has shown that even an instructor avatar can go a long way towards overcoming this distance. Using I, telling stories from your own experience, and writing content in a more informal tone also helps learners to feel like they are being taught by a real person rather than a robot. Experts call this social presence. Give your learners the chance to participate in their own learning and create their own sense of presence. Ask them to participate in a discussion forum or a poll, for example. So with that in mind, here's another one for you. At the beginning of your synchronous course, you introduce an icebreaker activity. You ask the students to name a song or movie title that best describes them. Is this a good idea? All right, so you should now be seeing the results. 73% of you said yes, this is a good idea. 23% said no, and 4% were unsure. So we think it is a good idea. While it might seem like a waste of time, a little fun activity like this can actually go a long way towards improving learning because you're making the learners feel present and connected. And it's that relatedness that we mentioned earlier. They're going to be more motivated and receptive to learning. And even if you are creating completely asynchronous training without any kind of student cohort, you can prompt learners with a reflection question. Ask them to think about how this content fits with their experience or how they might apply it in the real world. In other words, address them like real humans.
So thinking about our learners as real humans also means thinking about them as a diverse group. So images and examples should be reflective of a variety of races and ethnicities, genders, classes, and abilities. That's probably fairly obvious. And obviously you also want to avoid stereotypes when depicting this diversity, but go deeper. Instead of just thinking about diversity, think about inclusivity. Do all of your learners feel included by your course? So really think about whether your learning is inclusive of a variety of backgrounds, whether it avoids assumptions and oppressive structures. And you need to do this reflection and analysis from the course level right down to the sentence level. So at the course level, think about things like access and the systems that you might be upholding. So for example, do your assignments require certain technologies or software that not everyone has access to or can afford? Have you made it accessible for learners with disabilities? I'll talk more about this in a moment. Do your scenarios reinforce particular stereotypes or problematic norms? Like, do all the scenarios have male bosses and female subordinates? Do you include content warnings when you teach sensitive topics? These are just a few examples to show really different ways that your course can be inclusive or not. At the sentence level, you need to think about things like pronouns, plain language, and idioms. So do you use phrases like his or her instead of the more inclusive they? Do you ask students about their pronouns, or do you make assumptions about their gender identity? We've already talked a little bit about using plain language. In addition to helping reduce cognitive load, plain language is more inclusive. Maybe your learners are English language learners, or have learning disabilities, or don't have the same level of education. Being inclusive also means recognizing that learners may come from a variety of backgrounds and may represent different groups. So your idiosyncratic expression might not be familiar to someone from another country, even if they're fluent in English. So I would say you have to put yourself in their shoes, But that's a good example of an idiom that might sound strange to someone not familiar with it. So let's just say you have to try to see things from your learner's perspective. Your reference to a particular TV show or video game or celebrity might seem like a fun way to engage your audience and bring some levity, but it also might not be familiar to someone from a different generation or place. So we're going to play a little game. And before you put any answers or anything in the chat, we are going to do another poll. I want to ask how many of you know who this character is? And as you're answering, I also want you to think about this. Unless I provide a description of this image or an alternative link to it, anyone with a visual impairment following this presentation has already been excluded. I'll give you a moment to look at this face if you can see it, and put an answer there. All right, real mix. 38% said of course, about 13%, I think so, but not sure. 50% have no clue. So this is Relic, a character from The Beachcombers, which was one of the most popular and long-running Canadian shows ever, which ran from 1972 to 1990. So if you are a millennial or not from Canada, you probably had no idea. Someone who watched the show faithfully for years might think, of course everyone knows this. It's so familiar to them that it seems obvious. But if they used a reference to Relic in their course, they might be alienating half their audience. So it's often difficult to recognize our own perspectives and cognitive biases and how these might be inadvertently affecting our courses. So get help from an equity, diversity, and inclusion expert if you can. Seek out professional development opportunities for yourself too. There are many workshops on things like decolonizing education offered at different institutions. And it's also okay to admit that you're still learning. If you make a mistake or overlook something, listen and adapt. So if you want to learn more about the inclusive use of pronouns specifically that I mentioned, you can watch a little 3-minute free video that we made with the Pride Center of Edmonton. And we're going to put the link up in the chat right now, but you can also find it through our website. And now Sherry is going to talk a bit more about that accessibility piece that I mentioned.
Great. So just to get started, we could probably do an entire webinar just on accessibility, and we still wouldn't touch everything. So this is by no means everything you need to know about accessibility. Accessibility means that learners with various disabilities can still complete and participate in the course. Oftentimes, certain organizations, governing bodies, or legislation will dictate that online courses must meet a certain accessibility standard. You might have heard of the International Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, or specific legislation like Ontario's AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. There are lots of guidelines to follow to accommodate a variety of needs. The important thing is to approach accessibility not in terms of what you have to do to be compliant, but what you should do to be truly inclusive. Building a course that is not navigable by a screen reader, or with a font that's too small to read, or doesn't have enough contrast with the background, or a course that doesn't provide alternative text for images, doesn't just exclude a few learners. It sends a message that everyone's learning is not valued equally. Ensuring that your course is fully accessible can be confusing, as there are a lot of different needs that need to be met. We definitely recommend getting help from an accessibility expert. So we hope that you found the principles we've shared today helpful. Putting the learner first is, as you've seen, a matter of equity and inclusion. But putting the learner first also means that they learn better. So if you want your training to lead to some kind of behavioral change, you are way more likely to achieve that goal if you think about what your learner needs for learning before you think about what you want them to learn. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I will now turn you back over to Bo.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherry and Jennifer. Very well presented, very informative. At this time, we're going to open it up for some questions for the team. So if you'd like to type them into the chat box, we can go through there. Or if you'd like, just unmute your mic and ask a question. We can start a discussion.
I have a question from earlier in the presentation for Jennifer and Sherry. Mel asked about the feasibility of using GIFs in between chunks of learning info as a break for the learners. Sort of this, you talked about space and pictures. Would GIFs be appropriate for that as well?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that to provide a little transition with a little bit of levity and in that kind of context, I think could be helpful. The problem is when it's on there at the same time as you're trying to present content, and then the content is what gets pushed out. But to provide a little break, a little transition to help you with that chunking, that's where, yeah, I think that could be a great use of that. So you could still bring in that fun piece if you wanted to, in a different kind of way.
Awesome. Any questions?
Looks like Kyle has their hand raised.
Oh, yes, I see that.
Oh, hi. Thanks for the presentation. That was really helpful. Somebody just said, what does my learner want for learning, as opposed to what do I want them to learn? However, as teachers or professors, we have to develop a syllabus, and then we have to get that syllabus confirmed by our director before we even meet our learners. So how do we deal with not knowing who our learners are before we have to develop the content?
Sherry, Jennifer, who would like to take this one? Sherry.
I can take that. Yeah, and Kyle, thanks for that question. I think it's really important that we can't always do that first. Now, having said that, you probably have a somewhat of an idea of the kind of learner who will be taking your course. And then I think that's what's really important is that whole process of creating that syllabus and determining the learning outcomes is actually a very foundational part of creating your course, whether it be online, face-to-face, synchronous, asynchronous. It needs to be that guiding framework for building your course. And you need to use those learning outcomes to bring back that colander visual to catch what you want to teach. Because oftentimes, and I've worked with instructors who believe that process is kind of an afterthought, or they can just do it later, but it really guides what we teach. And so kind of getting a sense of who your learner is, but also making sure that process of developing your syllabus, your learning outcomes, is that guiding foundation for building your course.
Great, thank you.
Perfect, thanks, Kyle. Mary Lee, I see you have a question, your hand raised.
Yeah, so I know, and this is going to be an odd scenario, but I know you said to use plain language, but if you're teaching a really technical, I teach anatomy and physiology. It's all long-term words and so forth. And I don't think I can do plain language with it. So I'm just curious about, and I have one other comment after this, but I'm just curious about how you approach at least introducing some terms that frankly, yeah, a lot, because I also teach biomedical engineers. So they usually come in with no biology, so they don't even have that background. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts.
Sherry, Jennifer, I think would like to take this one.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that some jargon is going to be inevitable, particularly in certain courses. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about plain language, we're talking about eliminating the big words that aren't necessary, so that, I mean, if you have a really long medical term, anatomical term, then obviously that needs to be there, but it needs to be explained, and it needs to be explained and used in sentences that are otherwise relatively simple and short, so that they can focus that brain power on those particular difficult terms. So it's when a whole bunch of the jargon gets used together, or it gets used in a really otherwise complicated sentence with lots of different clauses and that kind of thing, that's when it can become really problematic. And then I think just giving your learners as many tools as you can to keep reminding them what those terms are. So when you introduce the term, if you can introduce it in a context so that they can connect it to something in the real world. I think if you're going through a whole bunch of definitions, kind of boom, 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 and they can't see it or, you know, attach it to something that they can relate to, it's going to be a lot harder for them to remember it. But if you can put it in some kind of context, kind of give them one at a time when possible, as much as possible, to again reduce that cognitive load, and then give them any tools that you can to help them remember. So maybe there's like a glossary, like PDF or something that they can refer back to whenever they need to, just so that they can have that reinforcement as they're learning those terms.
And I have one other question, and it's not related, well, it is, sorry. So it's talking about inclusivity. So I mean, I did remote teaching for the last 8 months, well, more than that for the last year, now I think about it. And one of the comments I got on a student eval was that I referred to my student as guys without thinking about it. But I don't think of guys as gender. I just think of guys as a neutral term. And so I started trying to not use that term, but I found I was thinking so much about not using those terms that it was, because I teach very informally. So is there any tools you know of for taking words out of your normal vocabulary without like driving yourself crazy? Because I was finding I was getting a little robotic because I was so worried about using the wrong terms, which is not comfortable for me.
It's such a good question, and I wish I had a magic answer, because I catch myself doing it all the time too. I even do it with my kids. I have a boy and a girl, and I call them you guys, and then I kind of catch myself. So that's a really common one, I think. But I think practice is the biggest thing. And I think if you do find yourself doing it, I think just owning it, just saying, oh, I said guys again, sorry everyone, I'm trying not to do that. And, you know, again, it comes back to that presence thing, right? Like just being a real human and demonstrating the fact that this is something that you're working on, and you're human, and it takes some work. I don't know, Sherry, if you have anything to add.
I was thinking it was much easier when I taught kindergarten, but even now I think, I used to say, okay, boys and girls, but I think I would even need to now remove that saying from my vernacular. And so it is tricky trying to find collective terms for that varied group, and that you don't sound like, okay, friends. You just, yeah, I think you need to find something that's natural. And like Jennifer said, if you are catching yourself, apologize. It's hard for somebody to be mad at you when you realize you've made a mistake and you accept it and you own it.
Okay, thank you. That's actually kind of helping. I never thought about actually like apologizing to them for using it. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I wouldn't like bend over backwards, say, oh, I'm so sorry, and like make a really big deal out of it. Just say, I did it again, right? And just sort of own it. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions?
just wanted to share a comment from the chat, Bo, that for those instructors who don't sort of know who their students are going to come, a lot of institutions, and we know this from our experience as well, a lot of institutions have general student data such as demographics, and it's often from the marketing department. And that can often be a really great starting point for making a more educated guess about who's going to be coming into your class. Interestingly, a lot of times the marketing department has a better handle on who's registering for programs and classes than the people teaching them do. So that's a really great place to start if you want to make a little effort on that and start there.
Perfect. Okay. If there's no other questions, I just want to say thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Sherry and Jennifer for presenting today. We'll be sending out an email probably next week with a little information on where you can find a copy of this video. If you have any other questions, you can find us at onlea.org. And we're on Twitter and Instagram and all those other locations as well. But again, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. We really appreciate and value your time, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Thank you.